In this video, we'll be discussing Taoism or Daoism, depending on the translation. The author, according to legend, of the principally important Taoist text is named Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, and the text is called the Tao Te Ching or the Tao Te Ching, or most simply the I Ching, which translates to the Book of Changes. This text has significant similarities with what we might call divination and fortune telling. It works not entirely different from how a horoscope works. There is a mechanism by which one determines which particular section to look at, and then that section, determined by a random mechanism, should give some advice or wisdom for how to proceed or behave. The mechanism, as you saw in the reading, involves what are called trigrams and hexagrams. You see at the bottom right of your page the yin and the yang, and around them variations of the trigrams, which are combined together to create hexagrams. These read somewhat like binary, where solid lines are representative of being or existence, somethingness, and broken lines, such as these here, are representative of the opposite, not being, non-existence, or nothingness. Thus, in Taoism, being and non-being are held in balance, which is what the yin and the yang represent: the constant interchange, interflow, and exchange of existence and non-existence. And the two interpenetrate. The yin and the yang symbol does not represent good and evil in the form of light and dark, but instead existence and non-existence held in balance. Traditionally, in the same way that someone might read tea leaves or examine animal entrails to tell the future, in Taoism, traditionally people would throw sticks on the ground, and depending on how they crossed or didn't cross, would determine which trigram or hexagram to look into. Once there, these poetic verses, similar to a mystical horoscope, which doesn't change from day to day and month to month or year to year, would give especially the political leaders advice on auspicious times to go to war, to harvest crops, or to have a marriage. One could conceivably flip coins, even, having heads and tails determine being or non-being, to go through this I Ching and use it in a similar way that it was used in ancient fortune-telling and divination rituals. Contrasting from Zoroastrianism and its cosmic dualism, in which good and evil are battling each other. For Taoism, what's primarily important is not good versus evil and light versus dark, but instead balance and harmony. What is good in Taoism is balance and harmony. What is bad, if not evil, is imbalance or disharmony. I'll briefly mention one of the other important concepts in Taoism, which is Wu Wei, translated as actionless action or effortless effort. It's described as being like flowing water or going with the flow. If you've ever been in a lazy river at a water park, you know the metaphor which explains Wu Wei. In a lazy river, you can just sit back and the current will carry you along. You don't have to try. You don't have to expend energy. You don't have to input effort or struggle. Instead, you just sit back and the water will take you wherever it's going. This is the Taoist wisdom for how one should live one's life. By going with the flow. By sitting back and letting the universe take you where it wants you to go. This is very different from our modern, Western, capitalist understanding of how one should get ahead in life. In our culture and society in the West, one should struggle. One should give the utmost effort. One should fight against the current upstream or claw your way up the ladder. To fight for everything that you can get. For Taoism, that perspective is perhaps mostly a lot of splashing around and making a lot of noise, when in the end the results will be the same. One could certainly debate which is the better or preferable. But for our purposes, perceiving the difference is sufficiently worthwhile. What you see on this slide, then, I would encourage you to pause and copy down into your notes. On this slide, I have attempted to represent the relationship between good and evil, and vice and virtue, in a variety of the world's religious systems and their attendant philosophies. On the left, you see good and evil, virtue and vice, and good and bad, at polar opposites of each other, or at the extremes. This is especially relevant for the cosmic dualism in Zoroastrianism, as well as Christianity and Islam. And on the right, you see a very different understanding of the relationship between good and bad, vice and virtue, and perhaps even evil. For Daoism, which we are discussing now, as well as Confucianism, Buddhism, and importantly, the ancient Greek philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, good is found in balance or moderation rather than at the extremes. We will see this not only in Plato's Republic, where Plato is the author, Socrates is the main character, but also in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In that text, we have an understanding of virtue described as the doctrine of the mean. A similar doctrine of the mean also exists in Confucianism. As you look further down the page, you'll find what I have identified as the primary moral virtues in the two groupings I've listed. For Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Islam, what makes a person a good person is their faith. We saw this in the faith of Abraham, in Genesis, and in Kierkegaard's analysis of it. We saw it a moment ago in Zoroastrianism, where faith and obedience are primarily important in ethical or moral terms. And we will see it certainly around us today, and for the last many hundreds of years, in both Islam and Christianity. On the right, you'll see I've identified the primary moral virtue for Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and ancient Greek philosophy as primarily characterized with ahimsa, or nonviolence and non-harming. For those religious and philosophical ethical systems I've just mentioned, moderation is also of primary importance. That would be worthwhile to include in your notes as well. That exists to a lesser extent in Hinduism and Jainism. However, it is worth noting that every single ethical and philosophical system on the right side does find ways to justify violence, as paradoxically as that seems. Taoism could be used to send people to war in the same way that Confucianism can, despite the paradoxes we'll see with the core text of Confucianism. Buddhism even as non-violent as it is, from time to time, even from time to time now, can be spurred to violence. And the ancient Greeks were no strangers to violence. Nor is Hinduism. Perhaps Jainism fares slightly better on that score. It's worth questioning whether violence is inevitable or coincidental to human nature. Is violence inescapable for humans and their history? Or is it too idealistic to question whether violence can be cured or solved? Those questions run very deep, with assertions about human nature, in our culture, original sin, fallenness, corruption. However, in the context of philosophy, we can question whether violence could be done away with. Although the question is always as idealistic as it should obviously sound. Finishing out this page, you see 3/4 of the way down the page definitions of justice provided in broad strokes by these two different groupings of ethical systems. On the left, I've taken the liberty of paraphrasing the Zoroastrian dictum that justice is a sword for the wounding of the wicked, and translated that to what you see in front of you, which is that bad people deserve to be hurt or punished. My argument is that it is accurate to apply this understanding of justice certainly to Zoroastrianism, with its imprisoning hell, as well as to Christianity, with its imprisoning hell, and in a slightly different sense in Islam, which has a modified understanding of hell. But even more importantly, the metaphysic, the ethic, and the politic provided by this understanding of justice also influences our society, our culture, and our institutions. So that if God is justified in hurting, punishing, torturing, and or imprisoning breakers of the law and disturbers of the peace, then so are we, in terms of our politics, our society, and our laws. The definition of justice provided by these metaphysical systems is also shared by our real, lived political systems. And that's an insight, I would argue, is worth chewing over and pondering for a while. Contrast what you see on the left of this PowerPoint slide with what you see on the right, which is one of the many definitions of justice offered in Plato's Republic. That justice is never harming anyone. This seems to be much more in line with the concept ahimsa, which is not to say that ancient Greek philosophy or any of the other ethical systems on the right are completely nonviolent. In no way is that true. That's a paradox. Since we haven't defined a paradox, let's define it now. A paradox is a statement that seems contradictory on its surface, but should express some insight. It's paradoxical in the Republic for Plato and Socrates to admit this as a worthy definition of justice and then set up a military, which, by its very nature, must necessarily injure people. Perhaps the proper response to such a contradiction or paradox is to ignore some part of it, to ignore an idealistic understanding of justice as nonviolence, which is admittedly foreign from our cultural understanding. Or perhaps the correct response is to continue to strive for the ideal. We'll be dealing with idealism quite a bit as we go forward. We'll save a definition for it until a little bit later time. So keep that on the table, and we'll consider a few examples. At the bottom of the page, I've listed 4 relevant hypotheticals in order to understand the different ways in which these different understandings of the relationship between good and evil plays out in practice. Consider first premarital sex. If one wants to be a good Christian or a good Muslim, according to the predominant understandings of those metaphysical systems' ethics, the proper amount of premarital sex to have is none. 0. Perfect abstinence. To shun or prohibit it. There's a 0 tolerance policy, ideally. One should abstain or be ascetic. Let's give definition to those important terms I just used. Most importantly, you see the word asceticism, which I have attempted to simplistically define as the giving up of physical pleasures for a spiritual purpose, such as fasting or not having sex before marriage. Those are ascetic practices. I've also used the words prohibition, which you are likely more familiar with, and abstinence, which you are also likely familiar with. The same, before I get ahead of myself, consider on the opposite side the Confucian, Taoist, or ancient Greek philosophical approach to the ethics of premarital sex. Whereas on the left side, those ethical systems advise or require complete or extreme abstinence. On the right side, Confucianism, Daoism, Buddhism, and ancient Greek philosophy advise moderation. Notice that from a Christian or Islamic perspective, one could not have a moderate amount of premarital sex and be considered a good person, according to the ways those ethical systems attempt to define goodness and virtue. That's not to say that especially Buddhism, Confucianism, and Hinduism don't also have specific and strict, usually patriarchal, ethical strictures for dealing with human sexuality. However, an approach of moderation is of vast difference from an approach of extreme abstinence, or ideally perfect abstinence. Notice also that abstinence is the official ethical and or virtuous policy of the Roman Catholic clergy. A Catholic priest takes this abstinence, or shunning of physical pleasures, which we had defined as asceticism, to an extreme degree by becoming celibate. For Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and ancient Greek philosophy, a life lived at the extremes is not a virtuous life, but an unbalanced and therefore bad life. So that the pinnacle of morality for one religion is the height of an irrational life for another ethical system. So we can compare and contrast, at least understand the difference, and if one so desires, argue for which is morally, socially, and culturally preferable. Take homosexuality now, for example. If one wants to be a morally virtuous Christian, for example, the predominant opinion is that one cannot have a moderate amount of homosexual behavior. The ideal ethic or virtue would be perfect abstinence. It is prohibited. An extremely low number of homosexual encounters, ideally 0, is proper. If one has homosexual feelings, one should behave as an ascetic, giving up physical pleasures for the spiritual purpose. For ancient Greek philosophy, that life, not of moderation, but lived at the extremes, would not be good but bad, as we'll see in detail later. The same is true regarding the issue of abortion. For Christianity and Islam, ideally, the proper amount of abortions to have is 0, an extremely low number. They are prohibited. One should abstain. Even if you would desire to have an abortion, you should behave as an ascetic. What would moderation with regard to abortion look like? 1 abortion a lifetime? 10? We could wonder whether any different understanding of ethics is possible than that which is most common in our society. Which is precisely what our society is doing with regard currently to marijuana. At this point in history, a number of states have legalized marijuana for recreational use, with the idea that moderation is preferable to abstinence. However, if you're about to go to the local youth group, my understanding is that most would advise abstinence and asceticism, as opposed to moderation with regard to such intoxicants. I'll finish out a discussion of Taoism as briefly as I can with one of the most famous parts of the I Ching. Tao or Tao can be translated as reason, understanding, path or way or road, and name. So we might translate this opening paragraph that the path which can be traveled down is not the eternal path. The name which can be named is not the eternal name. Meaning that if you think you've grasped the truth of Taoism, you have not grasped it. If you think you've understood it, you have not. It's a journey rather than a destination, perhaps. It goes on, claiming that non-existence is named the antecedent, which means comes before, heaven and earth, and existence is named the mother of all things. In eternal non-existence, therefore, man seeks to pierce the primordial mystery, and in eternal existence, to behold the issues of the universe. But these two are one and the same and differ only in name. What this middle paragraph is attempting to express is something that Western logic considers irrational. specifically, for Taoism, something can come from nothing. Whereas in the traditional logic of the Western world, both in Aristotle and the medieval Christian saint and philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas, something cannot come from nothing. In our earlier discussions this semester, we discussed the idea that through quantum physics, a void could be creative. This idea is allowed in many Eastern understandings of logic, and largely disallowed in more Western understandings of logic. Which is more accurate? I leave for you to ponder that.